The end of this gripping Premier League season, making it 7 straight wins.
When's Kay coming in?
I think they're going to kick off when she gets here.
You think of their defenders, you think of Carlos just over 6 foot away.
And our match commentators.
Right, let's see what this election studio's all about then.
Lost the crowd.
Hiya. All right, mate.
How are you, Kay?
I'm good.
Sorry?
Come on, we've not got all night. Come on, let's go. Let's go.
Don't say no to this one.
Is this a prank? Is that Beatles about or something?
Yeah, Kay's about.
Look, Ed's already measuring up the screens.
Well, this is fantastic. We're going to have maps there, charts there, and more data over there.
As they feel the pressure, you've got to go tight in.
Where's Sophie?
Enough Fergie time. Time for election time, I think you're fine. You can both... This is my studio.
We're gone as well.
Gone.
Oh, God.
See ya.
You're fired.
Oh,
I'm not joking.
To be fair, I've always wanted to take you on live, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, he's all mouth.
Yeah, I reckon we can work with this.
This place will be our home on Election Night Live, and we'll be ready to bring you the full story first, here on Sky News.
Nice to meet you.
You too, my darling. I'm coming this way first.
Hey, oh, yeah, she knows.
You're going there first.
See ya, thanks. Much better.
A very good afternoon. No, this is not Sky News, nor is it Football Focus. I'm Adam Bolton, broadcasting you from the Times Radio studio in London Bridge, because we are all here to launch a book to which we have all contributed. The book is called The Media and the Messengers, about the general election. It's the most rapidly produced instant book about the coverage of this election, and indeed about overall about this general election. And over the next hour or so, we're going to hear from some of the contributors. Just to tell you about the book, I think it was barely a month ago that everyone had to have their chapters in, 31 chapters in all. It is the 60th book produced by John Mayer. He calls it a hackademic book, which means journalists and academics come together, as we're going to see this afternoon. This is the cover of the book. I haven't done a Liz Truss here. However, I think both the cover of the book showing a puppeteer running a puppet, and indeed the rather self-interested adverts for the election night coverage, which we're going to see throughout the programme this evening, the broadcast on YouTube, do show how important the messengers consider the general election to be, and how important they consider their role to be in it. Now, this evening, we're going to have 6 of the contributors joining us. They are, of course, Professor John Curtis of the University of Strathclyde, and the mastermind of the exit poll and BBC Psephological coverage. Also joined by John Riley, who is the former editor-in-chief and head of Sky News. Joining us is Professor Stephen Coleman from the University of Leeds, Dr. Karen Jackson-Brown from Leeds Trinity University. We're going to be hearing later on from Stuart Purvis, who we hope, who's a former Ofcom partner, and we're delighted that we're also joined by Paul Connew, former editor of the Sunday Mirror. Now, I'm just going to start very quickly by going round the houses and getting your quick thoughts, not just on the general election, but also on the coverage, because my feeling certainly is, whatever else you think, I do commend all the party leaders for their willingness to participate in broadcast. Perhaps we've seen a real decline in what they used to do for newspapers and broadsheet newspapers. But unlike every election since 2010, it seems to me that they have put themselves forward willingly for discussion programs and for debate. But that's my opinion. Let's start with Professor Stephen Coleman. Just quick reaction to the media and its messengers in this election campaign period.
Well, here's a sobering thought to start with. 73 elections have taken place across the world this year. About 46 of those elections are generally regarded as not having been free or fair. Oh, yeah. So to start with, we've got to say that within a massive global context, within a massive global contest for democracy, this country has managed to pull together an election in which the politicians have sounded different, they've sounded reasonably sensible, the journalists have attempted to ask sensible questions, and the public have had the choices in front of them. And for that, we should say it's no longer taken for granted. So it's a good thing.
Going to be the usual inevitable, well, we saw quite a lot of the pictures, didn't we, of the politicians picking up children and all the usual tropes and stereotypes. But I do think, as Stephen says, there have been some differences this time, better questions. What I think is unfair still is the way that we control the meanings and the message that we as journalists put out. For example, I'm sure Sir John will have noticed yesterday when he was on Laura Kuenssberg's programme on BBC Sunday Morning, that when Rishi Sunak, our current Prime Minister, was being interviewed in the chair, as has been true for everyone else during the election campaign, the picture behind him was of Downing Street with a big red paint roller across it. So the sort of sense of inevitability, I think, is still built into the way that we do it. Now, I know I've looked at it, and my students would say, "Oh, that's just a piece of the Union Jack." If you try to work out the graphics,
I think it's BBC branding. Actually, the BBC's colour is red.
Well, they have the blue there and the white there. There was a stripe of white, so maybe you're right, but it looked like the Union Jack. But they picked the bit that's red to go across the door and the window. And although that's a silly thing, it's the kind of thing that my students, when they're doing their critical analysis of how meanings are shaped and made, would say might be implying that Labour are definitely going to win. I mean, I think there's nobody here that doesn't think that, but those types of ways of discussing things, I still think are a little bit not neutral, let's put it that way.
John Riley.
So I would echo what you've all said about the willingness of before I come on to a low light, a highlight. It was the last BBC straightforward head-to-head debate between Starmer and Sunak, with Michel Hussein, last Wednesday. And I think, Adam, it was pretty close to what you and I envisaged when we first launched the campaign for the debates in the autumn of 2009. And I thought it was good because there was longer airtime devoted to it, and the two leading politicians who aspire to run the country had time to articulate their policies, and the questions were good from the audience. And if I had to pick a low light, it was the coverage of Sunak leaving the beaches of Normandy early. And I watched it all very closely, being a bit of a nerd. And the BBC did not mention it on the Thursday whatsoever. Not in its great flagship show at 10 o'clock, didn't mention it. Sky News didn't mention it. ITV News was quick, bonged it, and they had a report from James Mates on it. Otherwise, you know, the vast majority of people listening to the BBC, watching the BBC News Bulletin at 10, its flagship, would not have known anything about that story. It took a tabloid newspaper to splash it on its front page, the Daily Mirror, to drive that into the news agenda. The other thing that I've found, and I'm going to sound very old-fashioned here, is you've written about it actually, Adam, is how many opinion polls there have been. I think it's because they're easier and technology has made it really simple to do. Just feel we're bombarded every day by opinion polls. And I sort of, to echo Baroness Thatcher, the only poll that matters is the one on the day.
Paul Connew, from your perspective, pat on the back for the tabloids there.
Well, yes, as a former Sunday Mirror editor and deputy editor of the Daily Mirror, I think it's an occasion when print, old-fashioned print, got it right and spotted the real story there, the early departure of Sunak, probably the biggest own goal of the election campaign, apart from calling it on July the 4th. And broadcasting just did not twig it. I was amazed because it struck me, why is he not there? You know, what's going on? But it was extraordinary that, you know, as John said, in fact, you know, the BBC, Sky, Channel 4, Channel 5, you know, I mean, they just didn't feature it. It was quite extraordinary. But then, of course, it became the hottest topic across the entire media, print and broadcast. But it was an example, perhaps, of broadcasting not reacting.
Well, perhaps being a bit deferential. Perhaps people, broadcasters, just, you know, thought, well, if he wasn't there, there must be a very good reason, and it's not a story. Of course, ITV knew why he'd left, because he was going to do an interview with them.
Well, exactly. But in fact, but Adam, what also came across is social media was very, very quick. You know, ordinary members of the public were very quick talking about it on social media, while the main news channels were actually ignoring it.
John Curtis.
Yeah, let me make a couple of observations. I mean, John Wright is quite right that, you know, this is the most polled general election, not least because you know, the barriers to entry into the industry are now so low. It's also an election, however, which has seen methodological development in the polling industry. We'd had before 1 or 2 attempts at the so-called multiple regression and post-stratification, i.e. trying to work out what's going to happen in terms of seats as opposed to votes. And there's obviously one very good reason as to why those polls in particular have A, attracted publicity, and B, have been worth doing. And that is, it does look as though, on all the evidence we've got, and it isn't just those polls, that the electoral system is going to work fairly strongly against the Conservative Party. And the standard psephological assumption of, well, if we just assume every party's vote goes up and down by roughly the same amount as they would across the country as a whole, we can calculate the seats. That assumption is almost undoubtedly going to be wrong this time, and perhaps quite a long way off. So that's, in a sense, the greater number of people with the technical expertise to be able to do that has happened at the time when actually that I think has helped to enable people's understanding of how the electoral system may, in fact, have a very fundamental impact on the results. That's my one observation. On why the politicians have been taking part, well, I take the politicians have been taking part because essentially we've got a prime minister who's so far behind in the polls that he therefore has to take any and every opportunity that's open to him, and he would have liked more opportunities than he had, which, as you all know, is rather unusual. And the leader of the opposition at least didn't think he was in a position to simply say no. But my other observation is, I mean, you can talk a long time about who did or didn't pick up the story about D-Day, but the only significant event so far in this campaign is Nigel Farage's decision to intervene. That's the only thing that's made any discernible impact on the polls. And otherwise, I think where the politicians have struggled in that. I mean, it would be interesting to see when the academic analysis is done, but I cannot remember an election when on so many days the lead broadcasting news story was not about the election. And I think what's happened is that our parties are struggling to cope with the fact that the law now requires 5-week late campaigns. It's not 3 weeks. And that they spent the first 3 weeks leaking what was in their manifestos. We then had their manifestos, which didn't tell us anything new. And they have frankly had nothing new to say for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And that, I think, has helped to ensure that things like Princess Anne, the poor boy who got lost on a Greek island, the French election today, all these stories have penetrated into an election campaign. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but in a sense, I think I think this election campaign has probably dominated the news agenda less than I can think of any recent election campaign.
Interesting. Will Hutton, you of course, you know, write for the Observer. You've been head of an Oxford College and all that. I mean, from your elevated position, how do you think print has done in this election?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that that the kind of tremendous kind of right-wing media, which has been so influential in so many elections in my adult life, has not really, despite its efforts, has not really moved the dial. And that's been quite a surprise. I mean, I mean, GB News were kind of hopeful they were going to kind of dictate the agenda at one point. You know, but that's farcical now, looking back. So that's kind of a phenomena. I do think
farcical. I mean, Nigel Farage was one of their presenters.
Yes, but I mean, I don't think GB News has been kind of I don't think GB News has been setting the political agenda during the last 5 weeks. I mean, you may say that Nigel Farage has, but that's kind of whether he'd been a presenter of GB News or not, he would still have done so. I mean, maybe that was a platform which allowed him to spring into that position. And I think one of the reasons why the election was called, and when it was actually, was the hope that they were going to wrong foot Farage, and he kind of countered by kind of wrong footing back. I mean, I also think I think some points are being made about the kind of. I think the public service broadcasters have acquitted themselves well, but been a bit flat-footed, has been remarked. I thought, I mean, a standout moment for me. I thought it was comparing the Sunday Times of December 2019 with the Sunday Times yesterday was a real kind of surprise. Them endorsing kind of Labour, and I remember the blood-stained pages warning us about what would happen if Jeremy Corbyn would become Prime Minister. Kind of the contrast in 5 years extraordinary. I thought Channel 4 did a good job of work in Clacton, which I, and may have arrested the other kind of may have created a kind of a conversation around Farage that I think was kind of an important one. And lastly, I do think that too many questions from the broadcasters about tax and immigration, and too few about the outlook for public services on current spending plans. I mean, there's a crisis ahead. The IMF says so, the IFS says so, and it got one cursory question, and then you moved on, and tax became the kind of phenomena. But it's not been an election campaign which has been as defined by the media as earlier campaigns, in my recollection. I wonder whether others agree.
Okay, well, that is our six for tonight. As I say, Stuart Purvis will be joining us in a while. Now going to move on, as John Curtis has already touched on it, we're going to move on to the question of polling during this campaign. And I do stress, I hope we can have a conversation. I know it's difficult with 7 or 8 inputs, but don't necessarily wait for me if you want to join in after someone's made their point. I mean, I just wonder, Dr. Jackson Brown, it seems that there have been more polls than ever, but there's been less story in them than ever before.
I couldn't agree with you more. And the storytelling is something that the Gen Zs are much better at and are much more interested in and engage much more with than the polls. I do agree with that. But this business about talking about tax and immigration, that is classic, isn't it? Because the taxes, again, is what's in it for me. It's sort of going on what the greed, if you like. Will I be better off with this or with that? And then the immigration is about fear. And I think until we get beyond those things and really look for the people who are coming in to vote now, and really need to know what's going to happen in the future and how we're going to shape things in the future. I went to an excellent lecture by Stephen Coleman, who's on here too, with the Jay Blumner lecture recently, where he was saying that the new generations feel no sense that they lack of agency. And frankly, if we're watching just stuff about polls all the time or talking about who's going to attack, we all know about Labour and the blue-red tax discussion is tiresome, and they're not interested. Even the millennials are not that bothered by that type of topic. They care about how their lives are going to pan out. And I think, therefore, that citing polls is probably not the right way to go to engage them.
I mean, just
come in there just to say that I think one of the great academic researches after this election is going to be how Gen Z and how the millennials reacted and how they actually voted. I think we could actually have the scenario where we have the biggest election margin of victory, of modern times, on perhaps the lowest percentage poll turnout.
Professor Comer, I mean, talking about young voters, I mean, I keep on reading stories saying that they're surprisingly right wing, or at least a proportion of them are.
Well, certainly in France, that seems to be a pattern.
Professor Coleman?
Well, I mean, I think that is one of the stories across Europe, that not necessarily first-time voters, but certainly people in their late 20s and 30s are critical of mainstream political parties. And the main alternative across Europe at the moment is coming from the hard right, as we've seen in France. But I think that there are going to be 2 stories coming out of this election. One of them is going to be turnout. It's going to be a story that the polls couldn't tell us much about, because it's always the most difficult thing to capture in polls, where people always over-report that they're going to vote. And I suspect, and of course I'm here to be proved wrong, that there is going to be a significant drop in the number of people bothering to go out to vote. And I understand that's why the Labour Party is trying to get people to do so. I think the second thing is that there's never been an election that I can remember in which the consequences of the choices that people are making have been so concealed from them. And this puts us in a position in which the winners still win and the losers still lose, and the pundits still engage in punditry, but democracy suffers terribly.
What do you mean by those? What do you mean by those consequences? Could you specify?
So I'm thinking particularly about what has been called the conspiracy of silence around public services. That there is a consensus around what most people don't understand, which are called fiscal rules, economic imperatives that cannot be challenged. And the consequences of those imperatives are that what is already broken and causing major disquiet within the voting population is going to be in greater disrepair over the years. And that the battle that is going on at the moment is primarily a choice between the people who don't think that it's broken and are not going to do anything about it, and the people who do think it's broken and aren't going to be able to do very much about it. And I suspect that 2 years after the campaign, Britain will be looking very much as France is looking now, towards a position in which the mainstream parties are going to be judged on what they said during this election, and also in particular on the evidence and the justifications that they failed to give.
John Curtice, I suspect I'm wrong that behind that sort of sustained Labour lead, there actually have been some very interesting things going on in the polls, perhaps along the lines that Professor Coleman was just talking about.
Well, I mean, first of all, I would endorse the comments that we expect a low turnout. I know that Ipsos have compared their proportion of their samples, which are not internet samples, they're phone samples, who say they're going to turn out and vote with 2019, and it is lower. But all the circumstances are in place for the turnout to be low. So one is the fact that the two main parties are relatively close to each other. There's not much ideological space between them. Two, this is where the polls do kick in. The polls say it's all over by the shouting. Three, we have a bunch of politicians who are not very good at politics. They can't do the vision thing. They can't enthuse people. And none of them have come up with a broad synoptic message. They've got loads and loads of detailed policies, but the whole is less than the sum of parts. And then, of course, the bomb that the National Centre put into the middle of the election campaign was to point out that the politicians are now trusted as little as they have been at any point since we're measuring this in the last 40, 50 years. You put all that together, and sure, and the opinion polls that ask people about the policies, a lot of the policies, both Conservative and Labour, are popular, just that people are not convinced that they're going to be delivered. So that's point one. I mean, to be honest, Stephen, I mean, you're absolutely right that basically what both the main parties have done is they claim their manifestos are fully costed, but all they're costing are the marginal shifts. They're not costing the core business plan. So it's like saying, well, I'm going to build an extension to my business, so I will cost that, but I'm not going to make sure that I've got enough money in my budget to run the business as it already is. But there's arguably an interesting point behind that, which is arguably, well, you've got a Conservative Party that is deeply embarrassed about having presided over the biggest expansion of the state since 1945. All right, and we've got a Labour Party that believes you cannot possibly open up space between yourself and your opponents on taxation. Now, arguably, both parties have fundamentally misunderstood the impact of the pandemic, which is indeed that the public's concern is still now. Well, there are two possibilities. Certainly, at minimum, the public is now more concerned about public service than they are about taxation. But some of us bear the scars in the 1990s of being told by New Labour that that wasn't true then. And eventually 2 years into office, the penny dropped for New Labour. But the second possibility is that actually the pandemic has been like war, and it may well result in a fundamental change of the attitude of the public towards the role of the state. We won't know whether that's the case or not for 5 years, but certainly in the short term, the extent to which the party's been wanting to compete on taxation rather than the public service. I mean, in the case of the Conservatives, it's quite remarkable that for the most part, they have not wanted to trade on what they have above all achieved in this parliament, which is to get the country out of a pandemic and to save the economy, etc., etc. Now, that is involved in expansion of the state, but they're not actually wanting to defend what is arguably their principal achievements because of their ideological beliefs, right? So I think that's why we've ended up with this lopsided argument, but it's arguably partly because neither side actually fully understand. You can take opinion polls, but politicians need to be able to interpret them sensibly. And I'm not sure the politicians have cottoned on as to where the public are in this election.
But there's a remarkable irony going on here, John, which we should all note, and that is normally it's politicians crazily overstating during election campaigns and journalists saying, now come on. And this is the first election campaign that I can remember in which it's the journalists who are saying, come on, excite us, tell us something, give us something. And it's the politicians who are just sitting there tight-lipped and saying, we refuse.
But Stephen, they don't have the talents that are required. We've got, as leaders, right, we've got a prime minister who is a details person who therefore is in the wrong job for his skill set. And we've got an opposition leader who you don't want to be on the opposite side of of a debate, but who essentially, as a prosecution lawyer, is very, very good at filleting somebody else's argument. But what you need as a leader is the ability to create your own argument that can actually command the attention of the public. And so neither of them has the skill set that's required to be a really good political leader that can set a sense of direction and to give people the sense that they're being led somewhere that they want to be led in the way that Boris Johnson could, or Tony Blair could, or Margaret Thatcher could, right? They don't have that skill set.
Well, John, could this be the last or last but one election in which proportional representation isn't high on the agenda?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that we are potentially, we're all focusing on the Labour-Tory argument and missing the fact that it could be true if the polls are right, that the share of the vote that is won by Conservative and Labour combined will be the lowest since 1922, i.e. since Labour first became a serious player. And two, if those mega polls that all of you dislike because they dominate the news agenda sometimes, that if they are right, this could well be the most disproportional outcome ever in a British election. Although what will also be the irony of ironies, that could happen while at the same time the Liberal Democrats get less hard done by than any recent election. And rather than being the so-called progressives that lose out from the electoral system, it is the right that at the moment there's a risk of really, really being hard done by it. Well, but I think, Stephen, what that will do, it will create a debate in civil society about our electoral system and about our politics. But I somehow suspect that a Labour Party that officially is in favour of proportional representation and has passed a motion thereon at its party conference that its interests will disappear like the snow in April, exactly the same it did in 1997.
Well, Keir Starmer's already said that. I'm not interested in proportional.
Well, he never endorsed the conference motion in the first place, right? But the party at least did pass a motion, and yeah, sure, they'll forget about it, but there will be a challenge.
Could I just add very quickly to John's point, and that is Paul's question. It might not be the last election in which PR is not at the top of the agenda, but I suspect it's the last election in which we will not have a multi-party system that is.
We already have, right?
But which is meaningful.
This is the first election in which 5 political parties are fighting virtually every constituency. We had 4 in 2019, and it therefore means that in Scotland and Wales, it's actually a 6-party contest.
Well, arguably, 2010 you had a multi-party system because it produced a coalition. But what about you, Will Houghton? What do you think? I mean, how's the economic debate been? Has it been, as the 2 professors are suggesting, just actually missing the point?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I do think that. I mean, I've been struck by what John was saying in this respect. I mean, I do think that the real attempt by the right-wing media to get this kind of, surrender to the Labour Party, don't do that. We're going to be bankrupt within the first 100 days. The Sunday Telegraph this weekend. I mean, it's been hysterical, and it's been hysterical because it has worked in the last 30 years. I mean, it has worked consistently, but it hasn't this time around.
No, because you've got a government that's increased taxation, and even under its proposals for this election, taxation would go up under a Conservative government, right? So it's very, I mean, one of the problems the Conservatives have got, they're trying to argue against their own record. It's very, very difficult to do.
It's also, it has led. I mean, also I think it's led to kind of missteps in the way that the Conservative press have kind of have covered things. I mean, there's the Daily Mail glorying a couple of weeks back in the fact an exclusive with Rachel Reeves, promising Daily Mail readers that she wouldn't raise their taxes, and how much their views had informed her and Keir Starmer's desire to change the Labour Party. And I've been surprised again and again at how kind of confused the Mail, the Telegraph are in how to. And they haven't managed to sound a really consistent message. That, of course, reflects the fact there isn't a consistent message to send. But it is, if you're talking about the media, I think it's important and interesting. I'm also surprised at the way you see the Telegraph, the Times in particular, kind of fielding commentators that kind of want to lean into. I mean, Danny Finkelstein leaning into how rational he thinks Keir Starmer can be. Surprised from a Tory peer. I mean, again and again, this kind of a confusion in a time where it's hard to get kind of your ideological kind of sightlines correct. But I'm not sure that I agree with an earlier comment about it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket in a couple of years' time. I mean, I do think there's scope to raise taxes, and one of these things has been that the inability of broadcasters to press home council tax will have to go up, won't it? Well, capital gains tax will have to go up, won't it? And they stick to their line, don't they, the Labour politicians? We have no plans. And that's been, again, I mean, that kind of standoff has been there for all to see. And I don't think anyone's going to be surprised if there's some increase in taxation on wealth in the next couple of years to kind of close the kind of gap and head off the threat of further austerity in public services.
I think the question that's been missed is not the when did you stop beating your wife tax question, but actually why not put up taxes?
Yes, yeah.
In the circumstances. John Ryan, just to end this session on polling, John Birt famously banned the BBC from ever leading news bulletins on opinion polls. Sky News has led bulletins on opinion polls throughout this campaign. What do you think?
Well, when I was a youngster at ITN in the 1992 election, I remember Michael Brunson, the political editor at the time, a formidable journalist. He rather like John Birt said, I'd really rather you guys didn't lead on opinion polls. I mean, I when I was boss tried to steer the troops from leading on them, but you can't censor them. I mean, they're out there and they're an indicator of what people are feeling at the time. But I think one should be cautious about them.
I mean, the extraordinary thing I find is that, across journalism, people have consistently said it's not the absolute headline, it's the overall trend, and this points to a Labour victory. But the number of people who still say to me, who do you think is going to win? But anyway, now, next, we're going to talk about disruptors and some of the narratives in this election and the counter narratives. We're going to start with a video from certainly one broadcaster which saw itself as a disruptor, GB News.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Right, who's been watching GB News?
But I appear on it.
You appear on it.
I'm a sort of one of their required left-wing voices, often sparring with Nigel Farage until he decided that he was going to stand in the election, on the basis that I think you can't ignore GB News. Better to go on and argue against their standpoint rather than not boycott it, which I think is vanity. And also, I quite welcome their shilling as well. But they are an effective force in a way. For all the controversy around them and all the dubious question of how can you have politicians as presenters, but you can't ignore them. And as I say, I feel you go on and argue from a left-wing point of view as an alternative voice rather than saying I want to appear.
I mean, from your experience, is it different in quality from going on the BBC or Sky or LBC or whatever, in terms of you are aware, or perhaps you aren't, that you've been sort of pigeonholed and that the overall message of the channel is...
Well, I duck some of their more extreme programs. I mean, Farage is actually quite a skilled presenter. You know, Rees-Mogg is quite a civilized presenter, and also I do Michael Portillo's program, which is very even-handed on a Sunday. There are some other programs there that I wouldn't go on because they are just the ranting equivalent of a shock jock. But part of their output is acceptable. Part of it is unacceptable. So that's a personal opinion.
John Riley, what do you think?
I mean, I haven't watched a great deal of it, but I don't think they've set the political agenda during the election whatsoever. I mean, they billed themselves very early on back in, I think, February as the election channel of the UK. Okay, they haven't been. They didn't hold a head-to-head debate. They had their political editor interview the Labour leader. That was about it. Nigel Farage, after 3-4 days, realised what he was missing and went off to Clacton. And they've missed him. If you look at their numbers are down, particularly at that key slot at 7 o'clock when they do normally quite well when he's presenting. He is a good presenter, I think. So I think, in the Paddington Basin or wherever they hang out, they will be disappointed that they haven't had the impact that they'd had hoped.
What about other medium, Dr. Jackson Brown? I mean, where are Gen Z, where are they getting, if they are, their information about?
They don't get it from GB News. For me, it's good student material. So when we're doing meaning making and shaping of society and how journalists fit into all of that, come October, we will look at GB News. But a lot of the ranting that you've just been talking about is very similar to the social media feeds anyway, isn't it? So it's very strange. It was the same with the reporting of the war in Ukraine, which we had in our previous book. My students immediately went straight for their phones and said, let's find out what's really true, because they didn't trust any of the legacy media that we're used to. And I think GB News frames itself in a similar way. So now that we're all trampling all over their stamping grounds, if you like, and the BBC journalists have all got their accounts on TikTok and whatever, there's more of what we think of as truth appearing there. But I still think they're after a good story, and so much of the way that the mechanism of preparing people for an election is still too mechanical for them, and just doesn't grab their attention. I don't know what anybody else thinks would be a solution to that.
I think one of the problems of both GB News and the Daily Mail is that their own private research is showing that around 50% of their readers and viewers are going to vote Labour.
Sure. So what are your younger viewers looking at if they are in political news? I mean, there seemed to be, I saw certain suggestions that they were quite cross that politicians were trying to get themselves into their feeds on TikTok.
Yes, they probably do feel that way. But I hate to say it, but I think we have to go back to that earlier thing about, what was it Sir John was saying about Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair and Boris. Quite frankly, so many people who perhaps aren't as engaged with politics as we are prefer the orators to the administrators. So when you get onto a Theresa May and a John Major and a Rishi, who the details men, I think we were talking about them, they're not as interesting. And because they have a celebrity culture, I have a nasty feeling, unfortunately, which is probably where Stephen was going with the far right in 2 years' time, that they prefer strong characters that they kind of believe in more than the details and the things that others of us might think of.
If I had to nominate the great disruptor of this election campaign, it would be Sir Ed Davey.
Yeah.
Would you agree, Sir Curtis?
Well, Dadger's
Well, I mean, he certainly tried to ensure that his party gets a degree of attention by engaging in visual stunts. I mean, it's not just unique to Ed Davey. William Rennie, who was a Scottish Liberal Democrat leader north of the border, was also famous while he was performing that role for his willingness to engage in stunts. I mean, I think it's experience of a third party knows it's quite difficult to gain the attention of the media, and therefore they know they have to engage in the exaggerated stunt in order to be able to do that. That said, I'm not sure that the Liberal Democrats have actually had that much success in communicating a broad message, because basically, again, Ed Davey's not very good at the synoptic thing either.
Well, can I just disagree slightly with John Curtis there, because among my friends, both Labour and Conservative, and I do have some Conservative friends, they're all saying that they think Ed Davey has come across as the most human of the party leaders.
Yeah.
Not just the stunts, but also, of course, that very moving film of him as the carer of his son.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think, you know, one of the problems that both Sunak and Starmer have here, and in a sense, in that sense, it's not dissimilar to Boris. They talk at people. They don't talk to people. They don't talk with people, certainly. Whereas Davey, you know, it's not just his stunts. You know, he's done dancing. I mean, and you're right, talking about, so Ed Davey at least sounds like an ordinary decent bloke, but I mean, ordinary decent blokes don't necessarily set the pulse racing, as opposed to, well, somebody whom you think you could certainly tolerate or indeed enjoy their company if you were out for lunch.
But you might end up with 60 seats.
Yes, but that is because but that's going to be a reflection of I mean, we have to remember here, right? The Conservative Party, if the polls are right, are heading for 20% of the vote. This is 10 points below what they have achieved at any point since the advent of the mass franchise. You just have to realize how unprecedented it is. Now, of course, the Liberal Democrats are able to profit off that if that's what transpires, because they're second in so many seats, and voters are so seemingly unhappy for the Conservatives. They will take whatever stick is available to beat the Conservatives with. But, you know, the question you have to ask yourself is the problem the Liberal Democrats will have after this election. Right, so we've got 11% of the vote, and we've got 60 seats, let us say. But the moment the Conservative Party recover in the polls, assuming that happens, they're in trouble. A large section of that parliamentary party will have been built on a very, very thin base. And I think they're potentially storing up trouble for them in the long run. Exactly. Actually, you know, we can see how the Labour story can go wrong after this election. You can see how the Democrat story can go wrong as well.
I think John speaking about, you know, getting the pulse racing. I mean, I think in this election, it's actually a question of finding a pulse. I think that what we're dealing with is more or less anybody who jumps into some water and causes a splash is going to be an electoral feature here. But can I just quickly go back to the GB News disruption, because I think you're all taking it far too seriously. I think GB News has as much effect on this election as Love Island is having on this election. I think it is, and I'll tell you why. I think it is a group of people who are self-consciously performing a cultural role. And they are so self-consciously doing it that the people who share their cultural prejudices don't need them to do it. And everybody else finds it cringing. And I'm rather surprised that they could be regarded as a serious part of this election, because I don't see it.
There's two other things going on as well, aren't there? I mean, I agree with all of that, by the way. I mean, the inability to set the agenda I spoke about earlier on, but it's also because, you know, the multiple sources of information, you know, the actual kind of weight of the news agenda every day makes it very, very hard for a kind of a tiny kind of almost de facto narrowcaster like GB News to kind of surface. They need I mean, they played off the factions in the Tory party in the last 12 months. But come an election, it turns out they're very much less influential than they thought they were going to be. And that's another thing. I mean, woke issues, the culture wars that were going to kind of set the world afire, you know, and the Tories were going to really try and, I mean, Kenny Badenoch trying to get that off the ground has been a notable failure. I mean, it has been resolutely kind of cost of living, tax, kind of immigration, mainstream issues, and the woke issues have really kind of turned out to be second or third tier.
I would argue
but immigration taps into the cultural divide.
that GB News
Immigration taps into the cultural divide.
Yeah, well, I agree, John, and I would argue that perhaps where GB News is significant is that if you take that block in print as well, with the Telegraph, the Mail, GB News, who have certainly formed a kind of symbiosis, that they are, in my view, much further to the right than traditional conservative reporting media have been in previous elections. But perhaps I'm wrong.
Yeah,
No, I agree. I think it's true, Adam. I think that is true. And that's one of the reasons why I think that the fears that 2 years' time the right are going to come storming back is actually very problematic. Around what program are they going to come storming back? What's going to can the right unite? Given that kind of part of them have gone so far off the dial, and part of that is kind of the seduction of being a kind of well-paid presenter on GB News. Actually, much longer will Paul Marshall put up with that? I wonder. Actually, I mean, just as
come off the board, hasn't he? He's
well, he's invested. I mean, the hope was he was going to become a second Fox News. That, I mean, really, I mean, fantasy in a British context.
Well, your point about the right is correct in terms of supply. I'm thinking of demand. So, you know, I think you're right. I think within the political competition, where is this going to come from? But I think that what we are piling up for ourselves by not having a serious public debate about these issues is an electorate that is going to get angrier and angrier and will be open to things that it might not be ideologically in tune with, but it might grasp out towards, as we have seen in so many other countries.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's move on and see our latest trailer for election night coverage. This one from the BBC. Cool. Just coming, I think. BBC's campaign is called It's Your Election.
It's your bin.
It's your bill. It's your shopping.
It's your commute.
It's your tax. It's your business.
It's your home. It's your family.
It's your pension. It's your operation. It's your environment. It's your safety.
It's your community.
It's your future. If it's important to you, it's important to us. Our coverage will make sure your voice is heard. It's your election.
And now in this final section, it's a chance for everyone to sort of pick out their winners and losers. John Curtice, I mean, what was striking about that BBC video certainly is how apolitical it was. It was saying, you know, there are things in your life, which, does that really relate to election coverage?
Well, I guess if you were really uncharitable, you might suggest the BBC was being a wee bit populist about the election, in focusing on the public. I mean, I have no inside knowledge of what the motivation was, but I guess that perhaps the implicit message that's meant to be coming from that film is that, you know, elections tend to be dominated by politicians. Politicians tend to want to try to control the agenda of elections, and that the BBC is committed to trying and ensure that the issues and concerns that the public have to some degree guide its journalism, rather than as it were, that symbiotic relationship between politicians and journalists that often seems to determine what appears on our broadcasting airways or appears in our newspapers. But this is Stephen's territory, so I suspect Stephen will have much better informed views on this than I do.
Press Common.
I thank you. I don't know. I mean, I don't quite see what the problem is here. I mean, so it seems to me that there are two things going on in any election. One is called politics and the other is called democracy. And in an ideal situation, they align. And the politics is inflected by a kind of democratic aspiration, and the democracy takes place within political structures. And that's all good. But I mean, it does belong to the electorate, this election. And for a long time, we know that the electorate has become more and more fed up with what they refer to as out of touch politicians, both during election campaigns and following them. And that's a democratic problem. And it's a particular democratic problem now. I mean, I was writing about it as a democratic problem when it was much less of a problem.
Yeah, but isn't it
right now across the world, just to make this point, right now across the world, this, it seems to me, is a real context, a contest in which this country as a political culture has to get it right. We've got to really do some thinking.
Is it easy? Isn't it a bit easy to just feed that at election time? I mean, to give you an example, seems to me that the American debate between Trump and Biden, where they excluded the audience, was much more useful to a voter than hearing Robert from Nottingham say,
"You're right. You're right, Adam. I mean, the problem is that very often when people see solutions, they see the solution, but then they assume that that solution constitutes a practical strategy. The solution is certainly to involve a discontented and disengaged electorate, but the solution is not necessarily to do it by just plonking them in everywhere. But if you look, for example, and I'll tell you one of the winners that I think from this election campaign, and you know, it sounds like quite an obscure one, the BBC's daily phone-in programme. Been running it on television and on radio, and month in, month out, leading up to this election, it has captured what I would call the mood of this country. It has been something like a mass media focus group conducted in a civilized way, bringing the dangers of polarization to the forefront and showing them for the danger that they are. And that's been public service broadcasting at its best. But I absolutely agree with, I know what you're saying, that there is a danger of a committee with a good idea or a good ideal in its mind, then sitting down and saying, therefore, in this election campaign, let us do all of our production with a few people from Rotherham sitting in the studio, because that will make it look more democratic. And I think that's, you know, that's a danger.
Carolyn.
Yes, thank you. I think one of the dimension that perhaps where it does work is not so much having the public in there asking a few questions from Rotherham, but as Sir John was saying, with the BBC saying it's your election, it's your this, it's your that. I noticed yesterday on Laura's show again that when she was talking to the Prime Minister, she was interrupting him. So the dimension for the public is to say, we don't want you performing your speeches and slogans the way you always do. So every time he tried to give one of his slogans out or slag off Keir Starmer, Laura would look at her iPad and she'd use that as a device and say, the public, the viewers, the public service, we're the broadcasters on their behalf, are saying, please, will you not talk about the other team? Can you talk about what you're going to do? And that intervention, a bit like breaking the fourth wall, I thought was new for this election, where it's trying to say, and the political actors are the problem, in my opinion, as well as us colluding with them, in that they insist on just giving these smooth performances, inevitable, predictable ones. And when us, the public, want them to cut in and break that, they've got to play their part, which the Prime Minister didn't do yesterday.
A question for John Riley and for you, Adam, as well. Should there have been a compromise between the 6 head-to-heads that Rishi Sunak wanted and the 2 Keir Starmer would agree to. Was that too few in the case of just having 2 head-to-heads?
I don't think it was too few. I think ultimately only 2 people at the moment in this country can head for number 10. I think what has been missing, Nick Robinson's done it a bit on the BBC, is proper old-fashioned sit-down, hour-long interviews with the key leaders. The BBC has done it. It just doesn't happen the way that it did when I was a child. Going on the issue of that promo, that's a promo I can't get that excited about. It's a promo that ITV might have run. We might have run it at Sky. I think it's just trying to engage the public in the story.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Do you think people have been bored by the election, John?
Yeah, I do.
Why?
And you see it in the numbers, because as we said earlier, the characters involved are not appealing. They're not dynamic. They're bland. They're dull. They're interested, maybe rightly, in the detail. We don't have the leaders that we used to have. And television loves passion and characters, and we live in a celebrity age more than we did. The stories that have cut through on the ratings have been the non-election stories.
Yeah.
People disappearing in Greece, the poor teenager in Tenerife, the French election, political story, admittedly. The UK election has been a bit listless.
Yeah, but
apart from the gambling story and the D-Day story, the two election stories that the public have noticed. Yeah,
I think
it's certainly cut through.
There've been a lot of gaffes, and you know, Farage we had coming into the election, playing us like a fiddle, getting coverage for not standing, and then getting coverage once he decided to stand. We had the unforced errors of D-Day, even the Titanic and Rishi Sunak launching the election campaign in the rain and all that. I mean, as a picture story and a drama, it's been quite good. And then the gambling at the end.
But I don't think the electorate care about these individuals in the way that they might have had a strong view about Thatcher or Blair. They're just irrelevant. My children who are politically interested, in their late 20s, they just don't care about these current leaders.
But you see, that's odd, isn't it? Because this is a watershed election. I mean, in 50 years, we get maybe 3 or 4 left-right switches.
We see it as a watershed election. I don't think the youngsters do.
It's not just this election, is it? This is a long.
It's not a left-right switch. It's the electorate.
News avoidance.
John Curtis.
It's not a left-right switch, Adam. It's nothing to do with ideology. So this is the complete opposite of 2019. 2019 was an election about an issue, which was Brexit. This is an election about competence, right? I mean, at the end of the day, all you really need to know as to why we are where we are is 1, Boris Johnson and Partygate, and 2, the Liz Truss and the fiscal event. These are the 2 defining events of the last 5 years, and they are the 2 events that are effectively looking as though they're going to determine the outcome of this election. And those are complaints about somebody's ethics and their ability to perform the role of 10 Downing Street in a proper manner, and the other is about somebody who's just the public came to the conclusion fairly rapidly was utterly incompetent because they generated and presided over a market crisis, and no post-war government that has presided over a market crisis has survived at the ballot box. It's about competence.
Speaking of Brexit, John, is Keir Starmer wrong to have joined the conspiracy of silence, and can he possibly sustain his position on Brexit?
That, if I may say so, is a big subject to bring up 1 minute before we're due to end this program. So very briefly, I mean, my answer to you is that it's difficult to prove that he was wrong, but we now know that it proved to be unnecessary and actually not particularly effective. Labour's vote is still overwhelmingly a pro-EU vote. But the point is that Keir Starmer could not have predicted Partygate and Liz Truss, because those are the things that have just moved the electorate, irrespective of their views about Brexit, away from the Conservative Party. But it still means we've got a Labour Party whose vote is very heavily structured.
But do you believe the polls showing that the British public have now, clearly, if the polls are right, gone from Brexit to regrets it?
Well, it is true that you've got about 57, 58% of people who say that they would vote to rejoin the EU. But that is primarily, it's partly because those people who voted Leave are less loyal now than were those who voted Remain. But most of them on both sides are still loyal. It's a lot of it's to do with the fact that people who did not vote in 2016, not least, we've now got 8 years worth of young people who couldn't vote in 2016, and they're overwhelmingly pro rejoin.
Okay.
I just want to challenge John a little bit, because of course you're right on Truss and Partygate. I mean, it's indisputable. But I must say, I think deeper things are going on. I mean, Ivor Crew, in his blunders of government, he would say, if he was on this, he would say, name a successful policy since 2010, an unambiguously successful policy, and you're hard put to it. And actually, I think there's what Partygate and the Truss fiasco kind of exposed was that actually, they were kind of lighthouses, kind of illustrating more forcibly than anything else could, but we've been seriously misgoverned for 14 years, and nothing works, and want to give these people a kicking, and actually the dullness of the politicians that we've been discussing earlier. I think in one way, I think it's going to encourage tactical voting. I mean, as people really want, they detest the Tories so much, and it's a detestation that goes deeper than Truss and Partygate. It's a real sense that actually their ideology and their principles and values have led to profound misgovernance, the prioritising of things that ordinary folk don't care about.
Okay, well, I mean, we're going to count that as your final thought, but I'm going to go.
My final thoughts.
I'm going to go around all the others to just less than a minute, please. A final thought on this election, the media and the messengers and the media. What you would like people to take away, Carolyn?
Well, I'm just thinking about the Partygate and Liz Truss, how much of that, in fact, was flared up, but particularly in Partygate, by the journalists themselves. I think our role, we were saying, we only got a minute, haven't we? But we were saying with Rishi Sunak that the D-Day was picked up later and turned into a thing. I would say the same might have been true of Partygate, which of course Rishi was also fined for that, but he's in power. So I think we have a bigger role than we think we do.
Partygate was when the polls started to divide, wasn't it? Professor Coleman.
2 points. One, BAFTA award or whatever you guys give to people, to Channel 4 for their story on reform. That was the great media moment of this campaign, as far as I'm concerned, and lots of questions to be asked about why the investigative journalism came from them and not from other channels. And the second point in relation to what Will Hutton has said, tactical voting, very important indeed. But let us remember, that wouldn't be able to happen with anything like its current sophistication without something else that is a crucial part of the media now, and that is, of course, the internet. And the fact that people can go online and work out, without being John Curtis type methodologists, how to vote in their constituency, in their region, is pretty terrific and a boon for democracy. And for all of the bad things that people say about online politics, that's a part of online politics that we should celebrate.
Walk on you.
I think the story after July the 4th would be less Keir Starmer's first 100 days, but the Tory party's future. Can it survive? In what shape will it survive, if it survives? Can it possibly stay together if those who want to join, to have Nigel Farage as their dance partner? Where does that leave One Nation Tories? I think that is going to be a compelling story, probably the most interesting political story after July the 4th, because I think Keir Starmer's first 100 days will be fairly undramatic, but the Tory party's internal machinations, civil war, and possibly complete breakup could be the story.
John Riley.
Insufficient coverage of the fact that the planet is heating up. I mean, and as is, climate change is a subject that excites younger voters. We've heard very little about it over the last 6 weeks. Should have been more.
John Curtis.
Well, I approached this election campaign expecting it to be relatively dull, largely because I think the whole thing, the writing was on the wall from October 2022. But that probably, although there are still only 72 hours to go to this campaign, it may well be that the most important media event will be election night itself, much as it was the case in 1997. And that in a sense, partly like Paul, probably this election is going to be more important, and what the media does about it is going to be more important as to what happens after July the 4th than what has happened in anything between May the 22nd and now.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. Those are 6 of the contributors to the general election 2024, The Media and the Messengers, edited by John Mayer, Andrew Beck and John Riley, available now in all good bookshops. And thank you all very much indeed for listening to this event on YouTube.
The end of this gripping Premier League season, making it 7 straight wins.
When's Kay coming in?
I think they're going to kick off when she gets here.
You think of their defenders, you think of Carlos just over 6 foot away.
And our match commentators.
Right, let's see what this election studio is all about then.
Lost the crowd.
Hiya. Right, mate.
How are you, Kay?
I'm good.
Sorry?
Come on, we've not got all night. Come on, let's go. Let's go.
Don't say no to this one.
Is this a prank? Is that Beatles about or something?
Yeah. Kay's about.
Look, Ed's already measuring up the screens.
Well, this is fantastic. We're going to have maps there, charts there, and more data over there.
As they feel the pressure, you've got to go tight in.
Where's Sophie?
Enough Fergie time. Time for election time, I think you'll find. You can both... This is my studio.
We're gone as well.
Gone.
Oh, God.
See ya.
You're fired. Oh,
I'm not joking.
I've always wanted to take you on live, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, he's all mouth.
Yeah, I reckon we can work with this.
This place will be our home on Election Night Live, and we'll be ready to bring you the full story first, here on Sky News.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you, everyone. You're muted, John.